Greetings and welcome to St. Nicholas for the October edition of our Thursday evening lecture series. This evening we are honored to have the Reverend Brian Iman as our speaker. Father Brian has his master's degrees in engineering and divinity and has taught at the University of Minnesota and John Carroll University. He has traveled extensively throughout Europe and the Middle East and received his doctorate of philosophy in applied Eastern Christian studies from the Balaban University in Lebanon. Tonight, Father Brian will speak on the topic of an Eastern Christian view of the Church. Please join me in welcoming Father Brian Iman.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me this evening to share with you an Eastern Christian view of the Church. But let me start with asking you a question first. What's your view? What's the Church?
The people.
The people of God. Okay, that's a good answer. Any other answers?
A family.
A family of God. Very good answer also. Anyone else? It's not the building over there, is it? No. No, this is my bugaboo with the bishops in the New Translation. Chram is a temple. So that's the temple. We are the Church. So it's a little bit of one of my little bugaboos with the bishops insisting on translating the word chram from Slavonic into church all the time in English, because that's the common usage. But as my former neighbor in Fairport Harbor, the bishop of the Hungarian Reformed Church, told me, you have a templo in Hungarian, we have an eshaz. And the difference between that is, you have a temple, we simply have an assembly hall. That's what eshaz means. So when our eparchy in Hungary is the eparchy of Hajdúdarok, simply because that was the village with the largest Greek Catholic church in it. But the bishop resides, and the pro-cathedral is in Nyíregyháza. Nyíregyháza means one church town. But from the cathedral you can see not only a Greek Catholic cathedral, you can see the Hungarian Reformed Church, and the Roman Catholic Cathedral, and the Lutheran Cathedral, and a couple of other places in the one church town. Eshaz, not temple. The Roman Catholic Church is also a temple. So we have to make this distinction, because oftentimes in our American society, we think going to that building over there is going to church. And going to that beautiful temple over there is going to the place where we worship God in the temple. And we have to remember this because we are one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. And so our church builds itself upon the apostles, not upon anything else. The apostles, the founders of the church in Jesus Christ. So, the very root and beginning of our church as a visible community is actually not when Jesus says to St. Peter, you are Peter, the rock, and upon my rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Okay? That's no problem with that, but that's not the first experience of church in its real sense. It's Christ speaking prophetically about the role of Peter and the other apostles. But if we look in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 and following, we hear that they, the apostolic community, devoted themselves to what? What did they devote themselves to in Acts chapter 2?
Prayer and service.
They devoted themselves to the apostle teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Now, when they're talking about the breaking of bread, what are we talking about?
Eucharist.
The Eucharist, that's right. That's the code word for Eucharist. Now, many of our Protestant brothers and sisters won't see it that way. They'll look at it and they'll say, oh, well, they're talking about the agape meal afterwards. Well, the early church called the agape meal the agape meal. They called the Eucharist the breaking of the bread because that was the action that happened. But they were celebrating the Eucharist. And so, this is the beginning of the vision of what the church really is. See, the church is not an institution in its root. It's not. And when we begin to think that way, we've lost the concept of what the church really is. It is not an institution. It's not even a divine and human institution in its foundation. It is a community centered around the teachings of the apostles, therefore the teachings of Christ. Fellowship, which is sharing everything in common. The breaking of bread and prayers. Now, what does it mean to have fellowship or to hold all things in common? Does it mean that the early church was a socialist community? Or that it was a communist community? No. It meant they held everything in common. That doesn't mean they gave up each other possession of their private property. But they didn't see the holding of that property as their primary purpose anymore. Everything. You ever remember at the end of the liturgy when the priest, if he's saying the typical Amvon prayer, thank God we now have restored many of the other ones, but the typical Amvon prayer, which comes to us, by the way, from the Pascha celebration, we hear, blessing those who bless you and sanctifying those who trust in you, save your people and bless your inheritance. Well, we hear there about having, that we love the beauty of this house, which is the temple, and that every good gift and every generous gift is from above. There is not a single thing that you and I hold as our own. This simply isn't that way. It shouldn't be that way. It's not ours. Everything comes from God and our cooperation with God's will and God's goodness. And so that's where we start really with the church. And all who believed came together in this early church, and they held these things in common in this very same way. They sold their possessions to help the church, to help the others, to care for the other members of the community, and to care for the community at large. They went to try to fulfill the needs of everyone, especially within the church, within the way, the ecclesia, the assembly. Now, also in the early church, when it was in Jerusalem, it also tells us, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they partook of food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Wonderful, wonderful understanding of what the church is to be all about. Sharing things in common, praising God, and because of the work that they did, they found the favor of the people, and God kept adding to their number those who were being saved. Now notice that. It's not those who are saved, or those who have been saved. It tells us those who are being saved. And so as part of the church, that's who we are. We are people who are being saved. We are called upon to cooperate with God's divine grace so that we could be saved. And this presents that ideal vision of the church at Pentecost. But that's really the ideal vision of the church all the time. All the time. And one thing we have to remember in our individualistically oriented society is that the church from its outset is a visible community of believers. No one is saved alone. No one is saved alone. Everyone is saved without limiting God's divine grace. The normal way in which everyone is saved is through their participation in the church. Okay, so first being clear, I'm not the person to limit God in any way in how he acts. But his normal way of acting in our lives is through the visible community of believers. We are not in this alone, and we are not saved as individual persons. That's a very un-Western thing to say. Okay? It would drive my Protestant evangelical friends up the roof. But they hear me say it all the time. And they're just like, oh God, how can you say something? I said, well, how can I say something like that? Because that's what's in the Bible. That's what's in the early church. Because that's what the church is all about. And they share this commitment with one another to hear the teachings of the apostles. And they shared fellowship with one another. We have to keep emphasizing that. Because how many times in our church have we forgotten that in this society? You know, we think, if I show up on Sunday or maybe Saturday afternoon and show up at liturgy, I fulfilled my obligation. Okay? Well, you don't have any obligation. I'm going to tell you that. You have no obligation to be in church on Saturday or on Sunday, just like God has no obligation to take you into heaven. He has no obligation to do that. If you don't want to respond to his call in your life, he will not make you do it. He will let you suffer or experience the consequences of your desire to be separated from him and from his church for eternity, unless we repent. So, we have to understand that we enter into fellowship with one another. Now, this word that they use throughout the New Testament for fellowship has multiple meanings. And the word that they use is koinonia. Now, what does that word mean?
Change.
No, that's metanoia. Okay, this is koinonia. Anyone want to hazard a guess other than the priest or deacon? What does koinonia mean?
Communion.
That's right. It means communion. And so here, communion, that understanding the fellowship of koinonia, means both the coming together in common and the sharing in the Eucharist. And we see this in so many passages in the early church. And it's actually the beginning of the format for the liturgy of the church. We see that time and time and time and time again. Both are intimately related to one another.